Not gonna lie, I'm a little sad they didn't stick with Tommy Ross's original hairstyle. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. As part of my 2020 13 Nights of Halloween series, today I'm going to be talking about the 2013 horror drama remake, Carrie. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, ranked lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Carrie stars Chloë Grace Moretz, Julianne Moore, and Ansel Elgort, and was directed by Kimberly Peirce. Based on Stephen King's 1974 novel of the same name, it tells the story of telekinetic teenager Carrie White, played by Chloë Grace Moretz, who uses her powers to get revenge on the people who bully her. Remakes have a tough go of it. Not usually in the box office, but definitely on the public opinion side of things. Add that to a genre like horror, which is generally looked down upon compared to other genres, and you've got a really tough situation. Carrie was not only Stephen King's first novel, but also his first story to get a film adaptation. It was also his first movie to get remade. As a movie, at least. The Shining got a 3-part miniseries in 1997, and Carrie technically got a backdoor pilot TV movie in 2002, but this 2013 Carrie was the first proper theatrically released Stephen King remake. We've seen a few more in the last couple of years, but this was a big deal at the time, and not one that people were very excited for. Again, remakes don't typically generate too much positive buzz, but I think people were, and still are, upset because it was a remake of Carrie. A lot of people put the 1976 original near the top of their Stephen King rankings, and many people consider it one of their favorite horror movies, period. And so, the idea of remaking such a classic movie is completely absurd to a lot of people. And I'll admit that the first time I saw this remake, I was very underwhelmed, and gave it a pretty low rating. So, needless to say, I wasn't too excited about rewatching it this month, but I did, and it wasn't nearly as bad as I remembered. As much as I hate to constantly compare original and remake when reviewing a film, I really need to, at least a bit with this one, because that comparison provides a lot of context for me with this movie. Even though I don't love this movie by any means, I was initially really surprised by my change of heart on it, and then I realized why that was the case. I just watched the 1976 original a few days ago, so it's very fresh in my mind. When I first saw this remake, it had been a few years since I had last watched the original. If you saw my review for that original film, you know I'm not a huge fan of it. I think it's alright, but I have a lot of problems with it. Having just watched it, I can remember all those specific problems, as opposed to having a few years to soften those issues and misremember it as something greater than it is. Like I said, I don't think this sequel's a great movie, but I do think it does a number of things pretty well, some of which improve on the original. One of those things is how it handles Carrie's mother and her home life in general. This film does a really good job of establishing Margaret White as more than just a religious fanatic. With the new opening scene, we see just how disturbed she is and just how deep her issues run. Whereas the character was certainly abusive and crazy in the original movie, the performance came off a bit over the top and hammy, so she was frequently unintentionally funny. Here, Julianne Moore gives a very unsettling and subdued performance. Rather than being stereotypical and almost funny, she feels threatening and unpredictable in her responses. I also think this film does an interesting job of trying to flesh out the overall story a bit more. Not only do we get more on the Margaret White front, like I just mentioned, but there's a good deal more with Sue Snell and her grappling with the guilt of what she's done. And so she and Tommy both get a bit more to do here, and come across even more sympathetic than they did in the original. That expansion adds a bit more to the authenticity of the story, but it does take some of the focus away from Carrie herself, which could certainly be viewed as a negative thing in a story like this. And speaking of Carrie herself, this is where things start to get a bit shaky for me with this movie. I kind of like Chloë Grace Moretz as an actor, but I really don't think casting her as Carrie was a good choice. It's nothing against her performance, she just doesn't come across as a bullied and abused kid with no confidence. You can certainly feel bad for her in particular moments, but the transformative aspect of the character doesn't feel as impactful, because she's never really that awkward to begin with. I mean, we've got the shower scene, but other than that, we never really see her not fitting in. And that has a direct impact on the film's biggest problem, the third act. And let me tell you, that's a tough problem for a movie to have, because that final third of the movie is what sticks with you when you leave the theater. Here, the climactic final act just doesn't feel warranted, and so it comes off a little forced. Because Carrie's had so little of a transformation, the prom doesn't have that same excited tension that it did in the original movie. I mean, you're still rooting for her, but she's not quite as sympathetic of a character. And so when things go down, it doesn't have the same feel. The whole sequence is too orchestrated and deliberate. In the original movie, it felt chaotic, and that's where the scariness came from. Carrie snapped, used her powers a bit, and that just really set off a chain reaction of events. In this remake, we've seen her practicing with her powers. So it's not just her snapping and losing control. She's targeting specific people and intentionally causing every incident to occur. So it comes across less chaotic and more malicious. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. The biggest pro is Margaret White. Not only was Julianne Moore's performance quite good here, but the character felt much more complete this time around. Don't get me wrong, watching Laurie Piper dragging a screaming Sissy Spacek into the closet in the original was certainly unsettling, but the character was so stereotypical and one-note in her fanaticism that it became unintentionally funny. Here, we get some more insight into Margaret's background and her relationship with Carrie, and even though she's just as much of an abusive zealot, there's something more disturbing about it here. On the con side, the biggest issue is definitely the third act. While the prom sequence was one of the best parts of the original film, it was one of the worst parts of this remake. I know it might sound a little silly given that this is a horror movie about a girl with telekinetic powers, but this prom sequence lacks authenticity. Carrie doesn't feel like a girl who snaps and uses her powers after years of torture and abuse. It all feels too deliberate. I wasn't a fan of De Palma's style in the original movie, but I do think he did a good job with the prom sequence. The lighting, the chaos, the destruction, it just doesn't have the same effect here at all. And then you add the hyper-stylization of the Chris and Billy scene, or even the final scene at home, and you've got one disappointing end to a movie. The second con is Chloë Grace Moretz. Like I said before, I've got nothing against her, or even really her performance in this movie. She just wasn't a good fit for this character. She's not believable as the downtrodden, bullied, meek teenager, and so it doesn't really feel all that plausible that she doesn't fit in to begin with. So watching her transformation isn't as satisfying. You're not rooting for her as much because she doesn't have as many obstacles to overcome, including her own self-confidence, which was perhaps the most endearing, sympathetic aspect of Sissy Spacek's version of the character. And so without that character arc here, the third act really falls apart. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Carrie or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Carrie 2.5 out of 5 paws. I was pleasantly surprised on this rewatch. It's not a very good movie, but it wasn't the awful travesty that I remembered it being either. It manages to fix some of the problems in the original, but also create some new ones for itself. I would recommend Carrie to people interested in a more modern, updated telling of Stephen King's first novel. It's really not that bad as an adaptation, and is able to incorporate modern bullying techniques like cell phones into the story without feeling forced with its modernity. If you've never seen the original or don't have strong feelings about it, you might like this remake, but if you love the original and view it as a horror masterpiece, this film probably won't be able to offer you anything better. If you liked Carrie, I would recommend the original 1976 Carrie. The story's pretty much identical, so it really comes down to the characters, performances, and style. While the latter two elements might be a bit hit or miss, Carrie's character arc is quite a bit better in the original film. If you want an example of a Stephen King remake that gets it right, you should watch It Chapter 1. It's an updated telling of the kid half of the It novel and is a really big improvement on the 1990 miniseries. And if you just haven't gotten your fill of Carrie, you might want to check out The Rage, Carrie 2. It's a sort of sequel to the original film that's not great, but tries some interesting things with the same basic storyline. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Carrie? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's a movie that you think should never be remade? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information on this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or add it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.